Burning Point.
Hello and welcome to the show with me, Katerina Kudashkina. Tuesday, Minsk hosts another four-party meeting on Ukraine, bringing together representatives from Kiev, Southeast regions, Russia and OSCE. Just to remind our listeners, OSCE stands for Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Days before the meeting, the U.S. House of Representatives voted overwhelmingly in favor of an anti-Russia resolution which, I quote, strongly condemns the actions of the Russian Federation under President Vladimir Putin, which has carried out a policy of aggression against neighboring countries aimed at political and economic domination, end quote. A number of Western analysts say the document amounts to a U.S. declaration of war on Russia. On the other hand, French President François Hollande made a sudden stop in Moscow to meet Russian President Vladimir Putin. Mr. Hollande informed his German colleague Angela Merkel that some progress has been made on the issue of Ukraine. Mr. Hollande said his meeting with Putin, and I quote, came at the right time, in good circumstances, and will undoubtedly lead to some results in the coming days, end quote. Well, that is a peacemaker statement, in stark contrast with the U.S. rhetoric. So, does that imply that Europe is about to disagree with its U.S. allies on Ukraine and its Russia policies? And this is something we are discussing with our guest speaker, Gilbert Doctorow, research fellow of the American University in Moscow.
I think that these two separate events on two continents have a commonality. They illustrate the divergence in directions of Europe and the United States at this moment. The fact that President Hollande went to see Vladimir Putin on his way back from Kazakhstan, the remarks that were made thereafter and which are followed up in his talks with Angela Merkel are what he would like to believe. And why he would like to believe that is the essence of our analysis. The French and the Germans have made progress in the ceasefire and implementation of the Minsk Accords, a precondition for reviewing and possibly turning back sanctions. If they decide, irrespective of the reality on the ground, that the reality is a better one and that there is progress in satisfying the Minsk Accords, then that frees their hands to do the necessary and to stay and turn back the sanctions. Now, in the United States, the vote of the House of Representatives is not binding on the president, but it is an informal declaration of war on Russia. It frees the president's hands to do whatever he thinks is necessary to deal with what is termed Russian aggression and a Russian threat to the post-Cold War order in Europe. That is one important straw in the wind, but it's not the only one. The past week or two have seen other developments where Washington, not the legislature, but the executive arm, is moving more aggressively against Russia. And I think of the attempts to isolate and to punish Orban in Hungary. I think of the spontaneous demonstrations against the Czech president, which no doubt have the backing of the National Endowment for Freedom. It's Washington financed. That is to say that Washington is moving with a heavy fist against those East and Central European countries that it fears are headed for the Russian orbit, or to put it more generally, are weak on sanctions against Russia. So the old continent and America are divergent right now in how they're approaching Russia.
How free is the old world in its disagreement with the United States?
Well, I have in front of me an English translation of the heading of a speech made yesterday by the deputy chair of Die Linke, the left in the Bundestag, in which she denounced Angela Merkel, saying, you do not have the courage to resist the U.S. government. In the past 2 weeks, there have been several very high-profile statements by leading politicians and public figures in Germany against Merkel's position on sanctions and on degrading the Russian economy. I have in mind an open letter that was signed by a substantial number of people in different walks of life in Germany. This was published in the magazine Tagesspiegel, and it goes under the heading Nicht in unserem Namen, not in our name. It has former president of the German Republic. It has leading politicians and as well as actors and playwrights and other personalities well known in Germany who are highly critical of Merkel's policy. In France, it is not surprising that Hollande would look for a way to back away, to move off the sanctions that France has supported till now. You have the very principled position of Marine Le Pen's organization, the Front National, and they are saying that they are not pro-Putin, they are not anti-Ukraine, but they would like the United States to remove its heavy hand from Europe and let Europeans solve the problems on their own. Now, this is a kind of very subtle message which is finding its way into the French mainstream. I don't think it was accidental that one of Nicolas Sarkozy's first acts in his final contest for control of his party, the UMP, was exactly to say, let the Mistral go to Russia. So in the public space, the influence of Marine Le Pen's party is increasing, and that is a position that is national, defending the nation against what they see as subservience to American interests. Where will it end? I think it's entirely possible that the U.S.-led policy of punishing Russia and sanctioning Russia will fall down in Europe, that the sanctions will not be reinstituted in March 2015 and may well be curtailed even before then. And if that happens, then you have a general situation in the States that is not too dissimilar from what happened when David Cameron was refused his bill authorizing force in Syria, and the United States Congress then turned on Obama, and he understood he couldn't pass a similar resolution in the U.S. Congress. So I think this is, strategically speaking, Europe is what counts, and these two different paths that we mentioned at the start, this divergence that came out so clearly in the last week, is worth close study.
This is Burning Point. We're discussing whether European politicians are trying to disagree with their U.S. allies on Ukraine and Russia policy. Our guest speaker is Gilbert Doctorow, research fellow with the American University in Moscow. It seems that several NATO intelligence officials seem to be saying that the West has been misreading Putin's signals.
Yes, but let's go back a little bit further. On November 11th, the online edition of Foreign Affairs magazine published a poll of its 29-man brain trust of experts on Russia. This is a follow-up to the essay originally published in the September-October issue by John Mearsheimer, asking the question, who is to blame, and answering that the West is to blame for the present confrontation and crisis over Ukraine. That stirred up a lot of discussion in the States because until now, the airwaves, the public space has been 99% anti-Russian, and anyone even thinking of saying something other than that was denounced as a stooge of Putin. Now you have Foreign Affairs magazine publishing in their September issue this critique, fundamentally overturning all the premises of U.S. foreign policy in Russia, but not only in Russia. And it created a storm. The result of that storm was a poll taken, as I say, of the 29-member Brain Trust, which concluded with the following. Fully one-third of the Brain Trust agreed or agreed strongly that the West is to blame for the present confrontation with Russia. When you consider that that Brain Trust is packed with people like Masha Gessen or Alexander Motil, who are viscerally anti-Russian, and there are quite a few of them in that group, then the fact that one-third would speak out, and they are identified one by one, their position statements are shown on the online Foreign Affairs, and you can view them by downloading it, and they came out, in principle, against the U.S. foreign policy. So after that, I think other people become more brave. I think what we're seeing is that a certain kind of civic bravery has emerged. The people who didn't, months ago, did not believe that the U.S. foreign policy was being properly conducted, have come out into the open. I think that's the big change, and for that, the Foreign Affairs article and the controversy which followed had a very salutary effect on public space in the United States.
And it's going to make a difference.
It will make a difference if Europe stumbles. If Europe holds the line and remains subservient to instructions from Joe Biden, then the attitudes of this 33% will have no bearing on the future course of U.S. policy. However, if, as I believe is entirely possible, because when you speak of crisis, you want to look at Europe, not the United States. You have caught me today in Brussels in the midst of the rolling general strike. The city is more or less shut down, and that is because of austerity programs. And over the weekend, you've seen similar mass demonstrations in other capitals of Europe. The policies that are identified with Angela Merkel of Europe-wide austerity and Russia bashing are both coming under very strong criticism from those who are suffering, and that is the man on the street, that is the domestic economies.
Sir, thank you so much. And just to remind you, that was Gilbert Doctorow, Research Fellow with the American University in Moscow.
Burning Point.
So, all eyes are on the position of Europe. And this is something we are discussing with our next guest speaker, Dr. John Laughland, Director of Studies at the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation in the UK.
I think Hollande's visit to Moscow may have helped. It was certainly symbolically very important. It marked a radical change from the harsh words that have been used by many European politicians, including particularly by Angela Merkel, who has been one of the most aggressive. Despite what people say, she's far more anti-Russian than many other European leaders, and certainly more so than François Hollande. So that also, I think, represents possibly some kind of progress, or at least some kind of change in the atmosphere.
Do I get it right that perhaps the perceptions of what is really going on in Ukraine are changing in Europe, or am I a bit too optimistic?
It depends what you mean by perceptions. I mean, the media reports continue to be very misleading. There aren't very many media reports, actually, at the moment about eastern Ukraine. We don't have a great deal of information as to what, if any, fighting is going on, or what territory is or is not controlled. It's rather disappeared, actually, from the headlines. So I wouldn't necessarily say there's been a change in terms of general public perception. Is there a change taking place among leaders? That's a question to which I would possibly give a positive answer. It's, again, difficult to know exactly what they think, but if François Hollande decided to visit Moscow as he did yesterday, that suggests that there is at least some kind of some kind of political will to obviously keep contacts open with Moscow and not to adopt a policy of confrontation. And in that sense, we might be able, therefore, to talk about a change of perception among Western leaders, at least.
How far could they go in their change of perception? Because, as far as I understand, the signals coming from Washington are totally different.
Well, perhaps you're referring to the resolution voted by the United States Congress last week, which was extremely aggressive. And Ron Paul called it one of the worst pieces of legislation he'd ever seen the Congress vote in his entire career. And goodness knows he's himself opposed many other pieces of legislation in the past. So yes, it was a nasty piece of work, that resolution. But of course, the foreign policy of the United States is not made by the United States Congress. It's made, as in every country, by the government. And while such resolutions can definitely contribute to a bad atmosphere in Washington, nonetheless, the final decisions will rest with Obama and with the State Department. There is a difference, yes, as you suggest in your question, between the language coming out of Washington generally and the language, some of it coming from some European capitals. The Europeans have basically followed America up to date. Certainly Angela Merkel has closely mapped the American foreign policy and has made a number of very aggressive declarations recently, including last week. But who knows? As I say, the visit of François Hollande to Moscow does make me wonder whether, in fact, the Europeans have not decided, perhaps after all, to at least put out a few feelers to Vladimir Putin in Moscow, and therefore perhaps to de-escalate the increasing confrontation between Russia and the West.
Dr. Laughland, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And just to remind you, this time our guest speaker was Dr. John Laughland, Director of Studies at the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation in the UK. Well, and now we end this edition of Burning Point, brought to you by me, Ekaterina Kudashkina. Thank you so much for staying with us. Goodbye, and take care.